Hello, welcome to this lecture on sociological theory. I am going to cover three main theoretical perspectives in sociology: structural functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interaction, along with important classical scholars in their development. You'll see on the slide that it also says Weberian theory. This took me a long time to do, and so I cut that out of this, but you can read in the textbook about Weberian theory. Theories are sets of interrelated ideas with wide-ranging applications that explain the social world and have stood the test of time. They are generally good at explaining and predicting social reality and have been rigorously and scientifically tested again and again. Remember that theories are like lenses. Each one can tell us something different about whatever it is that we're observing. Some theories, macro-level theories like structural functionalism, conflict theory, and Weberian theory, are aimed at explaining large-scale social patterns and changes in society, such as social inequalities and social institutions. They ask how these macro-level things shape social life. So for example, how does America's education system, a big social institution, affect what kinds of jobs people have? Well, if you think about it, the range of jobs that you can get is affected by what kind of education and training are offered. If there are no colleges offering majors in underwater basket weaving, then few people will become underwater basket weavers, or at least they won't go through formal educational systems to do that. The larger educational structure does not support that job choice. Imagine looking through a fisheye lens at this city, the image in the bottom right. You get the big picture. Oh, sorry, the image in that's a fisheye. The fisheye is wide, right? So the image in the upper, the top part of the camera pictures. You get the big picture or the broad view. Other theories, like micro-level theories, symbolic interactionism, are aimed at explaining relationships and interactions between small groups and between individuals, as well as helping us understand ourselves and our identities. They ask how these micro-level interactions shape and pattern the larger society. So for example, from the bottom up, how do people's individual and collective interests in having certain kinds of jobs shape what majors that colleges offer? 10 years ago, there were only a few universities offering courses in game design, and very few majors, if any, in game development. But video games have become massively popular in the last decade, or 15 years, and in part because students want to become video game designers, colleges and universities have responded by creating these courses and majors. So imagine looking through a zoom lens at this city. You see specific parts of the city in great detail, the deep view. You're looking at the city, regardless of whether you're using the macro lens or the micro lens, and you're explaining the same thing, the city, but you're taking a different focus to look at it. Now, the distinction between macro level and micro level social theory is really important to make, because early sociologists were nearly all macro level theorists. Why? Because sociology arose in the context of the great upheaval of the 18th and 19th centuries. The Industrial Revolution was fundamentally reshaping society. There was rapid urbanization as people flocked to industrial cities from the countryside for work. The forms and influence of traditional authorities like family, religion, and the state were all changing. Democracy was born through a revolution against monarchies, or through not one revolution, but lots of revolutions, like the Haitian Revolution, which was the only successful slave revolt to create an independent nation. They removed the French colonial powers. Early rights movements got underway, from abolition to the women's rights movement. There's a kind of quip in sociology that classical theory is the study of the ideas of old dead white men. This is true to the extent that they are all old and they're all very dead. But sociology owes a lot to non-white scholars like W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a civil rights activist and practically invented scholarship on race and philosophy, and who wrote extensively about what it was like to be black in the Reconstruction. And women like Jane Addams or Harriet Martineau. Jane Addams, for example, was another activist and an early practitioner of applied sociology. She did work on labor unions and stuff like that. The contributions of non-white and women scholars have historically been downplayed or outright ignored in sociology and nearly every other field. Academia, like the rest of society, was no less racist or sexist in the past. So we will talk about some of these people's contributions later in the course, but in this introductory lecture, I'm going to focus on these old dead white men: Emile Durkheim and structural functionalism, Karl Marx and conflict theory, and Herbert Blumer and symbolic interactionism. So we're going to start with structural functionalism, and you're going to associate this with Emile Durkheim, who is its sort of core founder. Durkheim's overarching concern is explaining social solidarity, which is the cohesion of social groups. What holds societies together, and how are they held together? This was especially relevant during his writing at the end of the 19th century, as industrialization ushered in an increased division of labor and other individualizing forces. That is, given all the changes that were occurring in society, how did people maintain harmonious moral order such that people felt togetherness? This is a really relevant question today, as our society is in a constant state of flux. How is it, for example, that Americans still feel a shared sense of Americanness, despite constant social change, political polarization, multiculturalism, religious diversity, and so on? We often fixate on what divides us, but Durkheim is interested in what keeps us together. One answer, one glue that holds society together are social facts. Durkheim said that social facts are conditions and circumstances external to the individual that nevertheless determine the individual's course of action. Do you see how the macro social facts shape the micro individual action in that definition? Shared norms are an example of social facts. When you give personal introductions on the first day of class, you follow a social norm, a script that guides what you say. It's not written down anywhere, but all of you know what it is. The script is a general social norm that governs how you introduce yourself. You have absolutely internalized or learned that norm. And you know that it is a norm. You know that you're expected to follow it and to know it. Because if you say some weird shit during an introduction, if you violate the unspoken agreement for how to introduce yourself, then everyone will stare at you or you will somehow be sanctioned. As soon as you attempt to resist a social fact, it asserts itself. Therefore, social facts are experienced as external, objective, constraining, or coercive oftentimes, and they are there whether we notice them or not. There's this quote I love: "Air is no less heavy because we do not detect its weight." That's related to this idea that the fish doesn't know that it's swimming in water. You might not like the social fact at first, you might not notice the social fact at first, like the discomfort of wearing a piece of constraining clothing, a bra or a tie, for example. But you become accustomed to the constraint over time. You forget it's there. And it is only when you get home and you remove the bra or the tie that you realize how uncomfortable it actually was. Now, structural functionalism, you might guess, has two key parts to consider: structures and functions. A structure is a social institution that is relatively stable over time and that meets the needs of society by performing functions necessary to maintain social order and stability. Education, government, healthcare, family, these are all social institutions. Functions are observable, positive consequences of a structure that help it survive, adapt, and adjust. You can easily name various functions of these social structures, both manifest functions, which are obvious and intended, and latent functions, which are less obvious and perhaps unintended. Now, according to this logic, structures exist because they are functional. They must be serving some purpose toward meeting the needs of society and maintaining order, stability, and social solidarity. If they weren't functional, or if they were dysfunctional, then they wouldn't exist, or they would change to adapt. So everything that exists must exist because it serves some purpose. This leads to some interesting perspectives. A classic example that might be a bit counterintuitive for you is crime. Crime exists, therefore crime is functional. So what are the functions of crime? Further, why will we never eliminate crime? It's impossible. And it's maybe not even desirable. I'll tell you the answer. Because crime serves purposes toward meeting the needs of society and maintaining order, stability, and social solidarity. It's weird to think that crime maintains order, but it does. In fact, You might argue that crime is necessary to our social fabric. I'm not saying that crime is good, like morally good. I'm saying that it's necessary. Crime defines our moral boundaries, what's good and bad. It reminds us what behaviors are acceptable and unacceptable. It separates good people from bad people. It provides over 3 million jobs in the criminal justice field, according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and so on. Prisoners are also occasionally employed for very, very little money to make clothing, road signs, license plates, pick up trash on the highways, and to star in scared straight reality TV shows. It is interesting right now that some of the people who we have locked up are being released, especially those with low-level drug charges. What does this say about crime? Well, it says that what we consider to be criminal behavior changes over time. Crime is adapting to cultural change, or perhaps culture is adapting to criminal change. This means that our moral boundaries, what we consider right and wrong, they shift. What we consider unacceptable now might be considered acceptable later, and vice versa. And people who we think are bad now, in the future, we might think are good, and vice versa. Social structures are interrelated. Think about the body as a metaphor for society, with each limb or each organ being a social structure. The head is the government, the heart is the family, the arm is criminal justice, the legs are education, or whatever. All the parts of the body serve specific functions that contribute to your continued existence. What happens if you lose your sight? You learn to perceive more clearly with your ears and with touch. If you lose an arm, you learn to use the other one. Your body adapts to systemic change, just like society does. What happens when a pandemic rips through a society? Government, healthcare, families, business, education, they all change. For something this big, literally every social institution has to adapt. Durkheim said that social solidarity exists, in part, because we are interdependent on others. That is, despite our individual differences, you need me to teach you sociology, and I need you to take it from me. I wouldn't have a job if you weren't here. Our society is so complex that no one, unless you're like a hardcore survivalist living off the grid, no one can get everything they need and that they want without reliance upon others. And I mean even the most basic of things. Your ability to listen to this lecture is made possible not by me alone, but by the people, organizations, and institutions responsible for your computer, for your tablet, for your smartphone, everyone from the miners in the Congo responsible for extracting minerals from the earth, for the microelectronics, to the assembly workers in China, to the CEO of YouTube. And that's just one part of how you are able to listen to this lecture. In his Christmas sermon on peace in 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. said that, and if you have the PowerPoint, I encourage you to listen to this. It starts at 7 minutes and 7 seconds. It really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality. Did you ever stop to think that you can't leave for your job in the morning without being dependent on most of the world? You get up in the morning and you go to the bathroom and you reach over for a sponge, and that's handed to you by a Pacific Islander. You reach for a bar of soap, and that's given to you at the hands of a Frenchman. And then you go into the kitchen to drink your coffee for the morning, and that's poured into your cup by a South American. Maybe you want tea, that's poured into your cup by a Chinese person. Or maybe you're desirous of having cocoa for breakfast, and that's poured into your cup by a West African. And then you reach over for your toast, and that's given to you at the hands of an English-speaking farmer, not to mention the baker. And before you finish eating breakfast in the morning, you've depended on more than half the world. This is the way our universe is structured. This is its interrelated quality. We aren't going to have peace on Earth until we recognize this basic fact of the interrelated structure of all reality. Since 1967, when MLK said this, our world is inconceivably more interconnected. This was before the massive economic and cultural globalization of the 1990s, before widespread internet adoption in the 2000s, So what's MLK's point here? That we have to understand the necessity of interdependence and social solidarity, and we have to embrace it to get peace on Earth. We have to get along. You see a structural functionalist perspective in here, right? Maybe MLK has read some Durkheim. Well, he did, because MLK earned a bachelor's degree in sociology from Morehouse in 1948, and certainly read some Durkheim. He also read Karl Marx. He also read Herbert Blumer, and learned something about symbolic interactionism. All of these theoretical perspectives that you're going to talk about, that you're going to learn about today. Now, here's a question. If you're following so far, it seems like everything just sort of works itself out, adapts. The system is self-correcting. Everybody knows their purpose. We have a place in the division of labor. Society is pretty stable. We have interdependence and social solidarity. There's, rainbows and everybody's holding hands. But this is obviously not the case. And Durkheim did address the fact that not everyone exists equally in the social structure. One of his most important contributions to sociology is the concept of anomie, which means normlessness. Anomie results from lack of social solidarity or social bonds, a loss of purpose or understanding of what's expected of oneself in the context of rapid social change. So, when a society is so complex and changing in so many ways, it is really easy to get sort of lost in it, to not know what to do, what to think, to not even really be sure of who you are. And many of us have felt lost, alone, isolated, purposeless. We tend to explain all of this from an individual psychological perspective, for example, in terms of moods or personalities or mental illness. And while this stuff exists and is important, Durkheim showed that there are sociological explanations for anomie, and indeed for even the most simple seeming act, suicide. He would say that people at the highest risk for suicide are those experiencing the greatest levels of anomie, that is, those with the weakest social bonds who are the least integrated into society. If I asked a class, which group of Americans has the highest suicide rate, most students say teenagers. Makes sense. This is what we see on TV. It's what we see in the news. It fits our stereotypes of moody teens and bullied teens. This is an example, though, of our common sense being wrong, of what we think we know about reality being really, really wrong. Remember, as you develop your sociological imagination, you should be questioning common sense. In fact, elderly Americans age 75 and over have the highest suicide rate by far. Why? Think back to my body metaphor. They are, in one sense, literally losing bodily function. I'm only in my mid-30s. My eyesight is going, my feet hurt. Get ready. But after we retire, not only are we losing bodily function because we're aging, but we're losing social function. Professional identities are really important for most people, and once we're no longer earning money, it's easy to feel and to have society tell you that you're not contributing, that you're sort of a burden. One simple example of our cultural perspective on the burden of the elderly is this. What happens to you when you get old? Where do you go when you get old? Typically, you get put in assisted living or a nursing home. Your family might not come visit. This is a really common thing. You just get set aside and kind of forgotten. How do you think that this makes elderly people feel in terms of social solidarity? Another thing, it's a blunt truth that every year older that you get, the more of your friends and family will die. One reason for making new friends and keeping your family close, right? Older American social circles generally get smaller as they age. They contract. So it's no wonder that older people are at the highest risk of committing suicide. And we can get even more sociological with it. You have noticed that this CDC data that I'm showing on this slide is for males. Males commit suicide 3 to 4 times as often as females in the United States. Why is that? There are other variables that also matter, like whether you live in urban, suburban, or rural environments. There are variations by state. These are all good variables to consider. There are good sociological questions you can ask about all of these variables, and there are answers for them, right? There are theories that help us explain why men kill themselves at 3 or 4 times the rate of women, and why the ways that they use to do it are different on average. So that's structural functionalism in a nutshell. Here's a little recap and an introduction to the next theoretical perspective, conflict theory. Many of us never realize the amount of control and constraint that society places on us. Yet, those of us who have taken a sociology class or two are aware of our own social positions, and being cognizant of that can be jarring. Durkheim gives us a structural functionalist framework for making sense of the stability of life and the layers of integration, control, and regulation that maintain it. Durkheim asks us to think of social solidarity and stability as something special to be explained, not as a default taken for granted experience. On the other hand, conflict theorists lean into explaining and seeking to correct social inequalities, critiquing the status quo. Instead of being held together by social solidarity and shared bonds, conflict theorists see society as held together by coercion and power, with those at the top with the most power oppressing those on the bottom who have less power. Think about this as another lens. Remember, we're looking at the same thing at society. Durkheim, structural functionalists see it one way, or it's one way to see it. Conflict theorists would look at it another way. They're looking at the same thing and they arrive at different explanations for it. Both are good explanations, both have validity, but they're focusing on different things. So in conflict theory, oops, that's the slide I meant to be on, so you can imagine that I said all that over that slide. Our key thinker here for conflict theory is Karl Marx, who is the one old dead white man in this lecture of whom you have undoubtedly heard. His ideas form the basis for this broad theoretical perspective, as well as the basis for communism. Many of you have probably read the Communist Manifesto, and his ideas have informed civil rights and social justice movements across the world. To understand Marx's critiques, you have to understand his social context. In the 1800s, he's writing in the middle of the 1800s and late 1800s. There was rapid industrialization, massive urbanization with all of its associated problems of poverty, crime, and disease, millions of poorly paid laborers working in hazardous conditions for a new capitalist class of industrial owners who sought to maximize profits. In short, Marx believed that capitalism, a new, at the time, economic system based on private ownership of the means of production in order to generate profits, caused modern social ills, especially the rampant exploitation of the many by the few. To understand conflict theory and to understand Karl Marx in the context of this class, you have to separate his ideas here from what you know about modern day communism and communist states. They're not the same thing. So take what you're learning here objectively and try and bracket aside the things that you know or the things that you think about communism in other countries. Marx's view of society places people into two general classes in relation to their work, that is, in relation to your labor: the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie are people who own the means of production, which is a fancy way to say that they own things that create more wealth, like a business. You've heard the term bougie, which refers to someone indulging in a luxury or fancy lifestyle. It's because they have money, right? They own things, they have nice things. It's bougie. The people who work for the bourgeoisie are the proletariat. This is like arguments you hear today about the 1% who have so much of the nation's wealth and the 99% who share what is left over. Crucially for Marx, the bourgeoisie exploit the labor of the proletariat. They pay them as little as possible to maximize their own profits and maintain their own share of power and resources in society. The proletariat have little choice but to accept the situation because, well, they have to earn a living. You can't just quit the job. They're on the bottom of the social ladder. Working a low-wage job is all that's available to them. This situation leads to the proletariat being alienated because they do not control their work. They are dissatisfied and dehumanized, functioning as an easily replaceable cog in a machine. Imagine low-wage jobs that you or people that you know have held. For example, I've held many of these. over the course of my life until I became a professor. When I was in high school, I worked at a Blimpies for about 3 years. Blimpies is a sub sandwich chain that got absolutely obliterated by Subway when Subway introduced healthy options and hired Jared Fogle. Hiring Jared Fogle turned out to be a problem because he was more interested in child pornography than sandwiches, and now I think is in prison. Anyway, I worked at a Blimpies. I liked it. I got paid minimum wage, which was like $5.15 at the time, and every so often I would get a quarter raise. I had nice bosses. My managers were fine. But I was absolutely alienated from the products that I produced. I served customers, did what my managers and owners told me. I was allowed one 6-inch sandwich per shift and a 30-minute lunch break. This is all standard in fast food. Otherwise, I stood and made sandwiches and prepped for 8 hours. Even if I had wanted more sandwiches, one sandwich cost more than an hour's pay, and I couldn't afford to do that very often. The work itself was boring, even though I did my best to make it fun. We used to listen to death metal in the store. Customers constantly complained about it, and we were reprimanded by the owners. In fact, they eventually fired somebody for it and threw our CD player in the dumpster. I was subject to constant control and regulation. I was alienated from myself, which means that I had very little autonomy, control, or creativity surrounding what I was doing. I made the sandwiches following other people's instructions, following corporate Blimpies instructions. I did the job on utter autopilot. It was what it was. I was a cog in the machine. When I quit, they replaced me the next day and paid the new person less than they paid me. You can watch a short film. It's called Nike Sweatshops Behind the Swoosh. If you're looking at the PowerPoint, I think it's linked maybe at the end, in the slides at the end. And watching that will help you think about alienation in a modern international production context, not American fast food. This is important because you have to remember that although the factories and unregulated labor conditions of Marx's time may not exist in your city, or they do, but you simply don't see them, they are the reality for hundreds of millions of people around the world. And as per Durkheim and Martin Luther King Jr., you are connected to these people. You might remember the suicides in the Chinese Foxconn factories several years ago that manufactured iPhones, Apple iPhones. Instead of, this was a case where Chinese workers had very poor working conditions, incredibly long hours in these factories, injuries from holding positions working on these phones, very low wages, and they were there was an epidemic of suicide. Workers were killing themselves, or trying to, because instead of changing the working conditions to prevent suicides, which would be a structural solution, right? You're changing sort of the structure in the environment to change people's behaviors. Instead of changing the working conditions, paying them more, making it safer, giving them more breaks, the corporation installed suicide nets to catch workers who jumped out the windows. I always imagine this like the worker jumps out the window, hits the suicide net, and it's like a trampoline. They bounce right back to their workbench. They couldn't even escape their alienation through attempting to die. So for Marx, alienation is a central component of capitalism. So if work sucks, oh, there's the video. If work sucks, if you're being exploited, if you have horrible hours or whatever, why do you keep doing it? Can't you just get another job? Can't you change the system? Can't we change the system? Can we argue for higher wages or shorter working hours and reform things? Why do most of us, most of the time, accept it? Why did I spend 10 years, 12 years of my life working minimum wage jobs, right? Accepting it. Why do we do that? This is in part because, as Marx would say, the dominant ideology, that is the system of beliefs, values, and attitudes that guide society, serves the interests of the bourgeoisie. It reproduces the status quo that sees them on top. Since the bourgeoisie holds wealth, power, and prestige in a society, they're able to spread their ideas, particularly through mass media. The proletariat, the workers, on the other hand, adhere to the dominant ideology even though it does not serve their class interests. That is, even though just like it keeps the upper class on top, it keeps the lower class on bottom. People in the proletariat, the lower class, the workers, they may be fatalistic about the situation. There's nothing I can do about it. They may have to do it, right? You have to work, so you take what you can get. And or more likely, Marx would say they are bound by what is called false consciousness, which is the belief that they think the dominant ideology does serve their class interests when in fact it doesn't. I'll give you an example, and you'll watch a commercial here. The American Dream is a great example. What is the American Dream? You have your own definition. Now think about it traditionally. Traditionally, what is the American Dream? This is the idea that anyone can be successful in America. You have to get an education. Like, there's ways to achieve the American Dream, right? It typically involves going and getting an education, then you work really hard, you get married, you have kids or family, get a dog and a cat, and you live out your days in middle or upper middle class luxury in your nice suburban house with a white picket fence. It's what most of us aspire to. Why? Because it is what we are told to aspire to. The ideal is reached by relatively few people, despite education, despite how hard we work, despite our adventures and love and relationships. Yet we persist in reaching for it. So watch this commercial for the Cadillac ELR Coupe. Now you can search here, Cadillac ELR Coupe 2014 commercial. I'll let you watch it. Pause the video and watch it. All right, now I have assumed that you watched the video. Think about this in terms of the American Dream. What is the American Dream according to this commercial? Buying a Cadillac is the gist of it. Buying the Cadillac is framed as a way to demonstrate your success, from your hard work. But I'm going to critique the crap out of this video. It immediately asks the question, why do we work so hard? For stuff? And then suggests that it might be for other things, but in fact, it is absolutely for stuff. Obviously, it's a Cadillac commercial, and it's telling you to work really hard for stuff, for a Cadillac, for a luxury item, right? Not a cheap car. Everybody, people can really use cars, whether you have an expensive or cheap car. Does that really matter? It might matter to some people because there's elements of status and quality as well, but a car, at its base is a way to get from A to B. But anyway, the commercial is telling me to work hard for a Cadillac. It suggests that Americans work harder than people in other countries, right? People in other countries stroll home, stop by the cafe, and take August off. You are an American. Therefore, you should work hard for stuff. You are not strolling home after work. You might be working late. And when you do go home, you'll do the American thing. You won't stroll, you'll drive, preferably a Cadillac. You are not stopping by the cafe. That's frivolous. People in other countries do that. They sit there and drink coffee. You don't do that. You are definitely not taking a whole month off work. You are a hard-working American gunning for a Cadillac. And the commercial says you're only taking 2 weeks off work, right? That's why we only take 2 weeks off in August. You're taking 2 weeks off instead of a month. Why? Of course, so you can earn more money to buy more things, preferably a Cadillac. What is this telling you? This commercial telling you, don't take vacation, work longer hours than other people, and buy expensive things. It is promising you the American dream for following these guidelines. Now, note how the commercial individualizes your success or failure. It says that you create all your own luck. Certainly, your choices matter, but the idea that you create all of your own luck suggests that there are no external factors, social structures that affect your outcomes. Everything, literally everything, can affect your outcomes. Consider age, race, or gender. The person in this commercial is older. Older people, on average, are wealthier than younger people. White Americans are wealthier on average than all other racial groups by far. And male. Men are, on average, wealthier than women. So this person, who fits demographic characteristics of the most wealthy group in the country, old white men, is telling us to work harder, take less vacation, and save up to buy a Cadillac. Then maybe one day, if you've created your luck properly, you'll have what he has. Who benefits from these ideas? You might, because you might be successful in this way. It's certainly possible. And that's one thing that keeps this ideology alive, is because people are successful. But again, it's a minority of people. Certainly your boss benefits from this idea, from you taking 2 weeks off. The boss benefits. Their employees believe they should only take 2 weeks of vacation time, so they're at work more. Certainly Cadillac, which serves as a symbol of success in the American dream, benefits from this arrangement because people are buying Cadillacs and seeking to buy Cadillacs. The bourgeoisie, then, the owners, benefit wholly from the ideology of the American dream because it motivates people to work hard and it generates profits for the owners. The proletariat think that they benefit, and again, the successes that some people do have serve as evidence that it works, but we rarely hear the stories of the vast majority of people who try and fail, who work really hard but are still poor. I will never tell you not to work hard. You won't get anywhere without working hard. But critique commercials, especially for luxury goods, and critique ideology when you find it. Who do ideas benefit and who do they harm? You can see from this example how conflict theory serves as the root of feminism, queer theory, critical race theory. These are all perspectives that say, hey, society is structured in such a way that resources like power, wealth, and prestige are consolidated at the top and among certain kinds of people, while other kinds of people don't have equal opportunities, equal access to those resources, or are otherwise disadvantaged. Examples of social movements and policy proposals stemming from the conflict theorist perspective include Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, the $15 per hour minimum wage movement, universal health care, canceling student loan debt, and so on and so forth. And that is conflict theory in a nutshell. If you're following along the PowerPoint, you can look at Weberian theory on your own and finish reading it up in the textbook. There's some good videos that explain that I use to explore this in a typical semester in class, looking at office space. Symbolic interactionism is the third and final theoretical perspective that I will briefly cover in this lecture. This is my pet perspective, my favorite. Most of my research and writing is done from this perspective. In contrast to structural functionalism and conflict theory, this is a micro-sociological perspective. It is not looking at how large social institutions shape small-scale interactions. Rather, it looks at how micro-level interactions shape the larger society. It focuses on the processes by which we share meaning in everyday life, the experiences of individuals and small groups, and the signs and symbols that we use in interaction, the social roles that we play, how we develop and express identities, and so on. Herbert Blumer, a key figure in the development of symbolic interaction, posited 3 premises. First, we act toward things based on the meanings those things hold for us. Second, those meanings arise through interaction with others. Third, meanings are modified through an interpretive process. These seem simple, even obvious on the surface, but these 3 premises have great implications for human interaction. The meanings that we hold for things are central building blocks of society. So let's consider an everyday object, a chair, right? Like this chair I'm sitting in. And you also might be sitting in a chair right now. We act toward things based on the meanings that they hold for us. What meanings does a chair hold? Well, something to sit in. It lets us rest. These are obvious ones. What else do you use chairs for? Maybe instead of hanging up clothes from the dryer, I throw them in a chair. So chairs hold things. If I need to change a light bulb, I stand on a chair. So chairs can be used to gain great height. Awesome. So we can have multiple meanings for any one thing, even at the same time. And depending on the meaning that we hold for a thing, that affects how we act toward it, right? Second, the meaning of the chair arises through interaction with others. How do you know that chairs are for sitting? Well, you've always seen people sit in chairs. When you were a kid, your parents might have said, David, sit your butt in that chair and don't move. That interaction with others doesn't only mean people, objects can be others too. So the chair looks like you should sit in it, right? It's got a nice curve for you to sit down and lean back, maybe a butt groove. Your interactions with chairs have taught you that, yeah, chairs make good seats. And they taught you that chairs can take on whatever other meanings they might have in different situations. They've taught you through experience what kinds of chairs are more comfortable or less comfortable, the soft cushiony chair versus the hard metal chair. Third, meanings are modified through an interpretive process. When you come home with an armload of stuff and you see a chair, you're likely to interpret that chair in that situation as being for holding your stuff. When you are trapped in a burning building looking frantically for a way out, you might interpret that chair previously for sitting as a thing to throw out the window to escape. The meanings for things shift and change, not haphazardly, but because we interact with others and we interpret situations. This means, crucially, that nothing has an inherent meaning. That is, all meaning is created and shared by humans. Meaning is socially constructed. Think about the development of conflict theory offshoots discussed earlier, feminism or critical race theory. These theories recognize at this point that meaning is socially constructed. The meaning of gender or race or social class, of smartphones, of college degrees, of political parties, of anything. None of these things has one universal meaning. Rather, they mean different things to different people at different times and different places, and we act differently toward others on the basis of the meanings that we hold for these things. So this is the key for symbolic interaction. How do the meanings that people hold and the negotiations that they have about those meanings shape the larger society? All right, here's one final example just to demonstrate the rabbit hole that you can go down to talk about meaning. What is this? You might have said it's a can of Coke. That's what most students say in class. No, it is not a can of Coke. It is a picture of a can of Coke. What is a picture of a can of Coke? I don't know how to explain it exactly, but it's an image housed in a movie file on YouTube. It's a bunch of zeros and ones that came from another image file on my computer that I got from somewhere on the internet that I suppose originally was taken with a camera of a physical can of Coke. But where's the original can of Coke? Who knows? This is like 50 steps removed from the original can of Coke. So the next thing that I might ask you here, okay, we figured out that this is, somehow an image of a can of Coke, but what is Coke anyway? You all have 100 different answers, and how you answer that question affects how you think about and act toward Coke, and how you act toward other people or talk about Coke to other people when Coke is involved in the situation. So for me, Coke is a bunch of sugar and calories. It's unhealthy and I don't drink it. That's how I think about Coke. For you, it might be refreshing, a treat, happiness. A corporation, it might conjure images of polar bears, like in the advertisements, or of hugging a Coke machine and having fun with friends. So all of a sudden, Bloomer's premises are deeper than they first appeared, right? All right, we're at the end. In this lecture, we've covered 3 key theoretical perspectives in sociology: structural functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interaction. Remember that structural functionalism focuses on social solidarity, how different social structures allow for the successful working of the whole society. Conflict theory, on the other hand, focuses on social inequalities and how power and resources are unequally distributed. And finally, symbolic interaction focuses on the meanings that people share for everyday interaction. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture. I certainly enjoyed making and recording it. Although, if you made it this far, I can go and tell you this is the first and only and last scripted lecture that I am going to do for this class. From now on, I'm just going to record myself lecturing like normal, slide by slide. It took me a long time to script this, right? To write out every word I was going to say, and I thought this was going to be something worth doing this semester. No way, I don't have the kind of time to do this every week, so I'm just going to lecture like normal and record it. It'll be great either way. I'll see all of you next time I see you. Thanks.